Hi, this is Nancy with On Point TV, Quilting with Nancy. We're continuing our series on the great basics. So these are the great basics in quilting, things that I've been teaching for years. Keep in mind, there's already 5 episodes have gone since this one. So there's everything from picking out your fabrics, folding your fabrics, proper cutting, proper 1/4 inch seam allowance, putting on proper borders, on point settings, which are my favorites. All of those are in the previous video. So if you haven't caught those, be sure you maybe backtrack and see what those are on. So On Point TV is my channel where I teach you all about quilting, and there are a few things that we have for sale. My pincushion pattern, which makes this pincushion that has a piece of magic plastic so that you don't poke yourself. So take a look at that on our website. That's onpoint-tv. And what started it all was learning to quilt. This is the larger book that I did that has everything from all those things that I just said, and half square triangles and flying geese and cable borders and applique and a lot more. So if you're interested in learning more after the Great Basics, I'd recommend maybe you take a look at the Learning to Quilt series. The Great Basics, that's this book. Now, this book is available on our website, onpoint-tv. So you can take a look and sew along with us to make the quilt that I'm making, which is crib size, and it has all the instructions for a twin size. So let's get started. So today we're working at a different location. We're actually in my studio because we needed to have some bigger surfaces to do the work that we're going to do. So here is what a couple of the quilts look like. So this is my first quilt that I made using the Great Basics techniques. So it's a 9-point quilt on point with striped fabrics for the setting, squares and triangles. The second one is one that there are some kits available on firesidequilts.com. So there's kits available for this in a crib size and a twin size. So this is the blue variation. Keep in mind, if some of the fabrics were to go out, there might be an exchange or a different fabric than these specific ones, but it would be pretty much close to this with the blue and the green and the stripes on the setting, squares and triangles. And again, that's available in twin or queen on Fireside's quilts. And this is the one that we've been working on. So this would be the pink variation. So we talked about all the different colors that I used. The quilt top is done. The borders are on. It's time to do the backing and the basting. So for doing the backing, you first need to know what size your quilt is, which sounds kind of obvious, right? So this quilt is square. And if I measure it, it is about 44.5 inches. You have to have your batting and backing be at least 3 inches larger than the quilt itself. So if this quilt is 44.5, if I add 3 to it, that's 47, 3 more to it, that's 50.5 inches. So I'm going to make my backing and batting approximately 51 inches. So all the way around the quilt, you want 3 inches. I'll talk a little bit more about why we want that 3 inches, but it has to do when you're doing your quilting. You have to have something to hold on to it. So I've chosen my backing, and here's a couple of tips when you're choosing your backing. One is it's nice for it to be a small, busy print. When you're working, and this is really the case with beginners, and it's just because beginners don't know. And they think, well, I'm just going to put a sheet on the back of my quilt. Or I'm just going to use an inexpensive muslin on the back of my quilt. First of all, you spent too much time on the top of the quilt to all of a sudden go cheap on the back of the quilt. I do recommend you go to all your clearance sections in the quilt shops and find some really good fabrics, but try to find a fabric that is a smaller, busier print. So this is what I'm going to use on the back of this quilt. Does it matchy the quilt? No, not many things I do are matchy. I also have done a series with the Learning to Quilt where I talk about piecing the backing. I love piecing backings, putting lots of fabrics on the back. If you want to know more about that, there is a link to that video on the bottom of this. So that will take you through the process of how, the idea of piecing the backings and how to do the basting of a really large quilt and having your friends help. So take a look at that. The link is below. For this quilt, I've chosen this busy backing. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. The second thing I would recommend is that it not be a directional print because we're going to have to put a seam on it. So this is the fabric that I originally was going to put on the back of this. So you see those mermaids, and the mermaids are all swimming in one direction. If I had taken this fabric and done the piecing that I need to for this quilt, the mermaids for most of the backing would have been swimming this way, and then the mermaids for this little 9-inch section I'm going to talk about would be swimming this way. Not really cool. Would it make or break the quilt? No, I don't think it would. And if fabric is tight, do it. Do whatever you need to do to get a backing on that quilt. So non-directional is always a good idea. This is another one that I considered, and this was not directional because the flowers do go in opposite directions. So in terms of the directional, this would have been a fine one for the backing of the quilt. But with the quilt having so much red in it, there's a very good chance that I'm going to want to put a red bobbin in the bobbin when I'm doing my machine quilting. And so in that case, I don't think I would like to see a red squiggling around on the back of this fabric, whereas on the back of the fabric that I've chosen, a red on that would not be very noticeable. So that's why I've chosen this fabric. And another reason I chose this fabric is it happened to be in my stash, and I didn't want to go and buy something else. I like buying perspective backing fabrics in 3 to 6 yards, depending on how good the sale is when I find it on the clearance shelf. So the next thing we're going to do is piece this. So if this needs to be 51 inches, well, the width of the fabric is only 44 inches, which means I needed to piece on, I think it was about 9 inches. I'm not sure about the exact math, but the idea to make it that extra 3 inches is you need to piece it on. So here you see I have pieced on the piece, and I pieced it with a 1-inch seam allowance. I have the 2 selvages together. That means that that's going to be very straight. And I just find that very easy to piece it with the selvages together. And I piece it with a smaller than normal seam or stitch. I like my stitch to be a little bit smaller because this is going to be pressed open. But I am not going to leave the selvage in this quilt. I'm going to now cut this off. So if I piece it with a 1-inch seam allowance, now I can nip it right there. So I've got about a 1/2-inch seam allowance and a 1/2 inch left over from selvage, and then just tear it. Because I am tearing this along the length of the fabric where the selvage is, that means it's going to tear perfectly straight. So I've taken that off, and now it's time to press it. When pressing your backing, you want to press the entire backing with a little bit of spray sizing. Now, we've talked about a couple of different spray sizings before, and for the backing, I must admit, you can use an awful lot of it. So if you're going to use the Mary Ellen spray sizing, you might want to consider getting a mister bottle, because the mister bottle, I don't know the magic, but it makes it last longer. And I think it's because kind of a gentle mist instead of the stream that can come out. So this has been very, very helpful. But if you're really wanting to save some money, if you're doing a larger quilt, head to the grocery store. In the laundry care aisle, you can find a sizing that is called magic sizing or Niagara sizing. What I recommend is you don't choose a starch. Starch is made of sugar. It's some sort of a sugar byproduct. Again, I don't know how that all happens. I just know that I've been told it's sugar. And if you spray the sugar on your quilt, and if you don't, then get it quilted and bound and washed, if you put it away with the sugar on the quilt, I'm afraid about what little critter is going to come and eat that sugar off of the quilt. Because I tell you, if I opened a box that had a bug on the quilt, that would probably be the end of my quilting career. I would have to stop right then and there. I am that afraid of bugs. So for me, I'm not risking it. I'm always going to use spray sizing. Sizing is made of some other magic, and I know the magic in the Mary Ellen's is pretty nice, but if you use the Niagara or the magic sizing, it's so much less expensive. It does, your iron might stick to it a little bit, but that's all right. You'll find your way around it, but do some spray sizing on the entire backing. So I want to show you, I've already spray sized most of this. Oh, why spray size? because it's going to make the backing a little bit stiffer, so that when you're maneuvering the quilt around for the machine quilting, it's going to make that backing stay stiff. Not as stiff as a piece of copy paper, but stiff enough that it's not just going to fold up onto itself. So I find I get many less puckers if I do this. It also is going to get any creases out, and with the seam that we just did, it's going to keep the seam open. So going to take and press. First, I'm just going to press it to the one side. Just get those little wrinkles out that happen when you tear the fabric. Whoop, almost lost my iron there for a second. Then I'm going to separate the seam. I'm going to open up the seam. Going to just gently run my iron over that to keep it open. And then I'm going to do some spray sizing. So I'm just going to use my mister, and it's kind of nice because you just hold it down. You're not having to squeeze it constantly. And then you can cover this, and I usually will do this twice. So through the entire thing, I'll spray it like this. Then I'm going to press it nice and dry, and then I'll do it again. I like my backing to be stiff, and if you noticed when we made the top of the quilt, we did a lot of spray sizing there too. I'm constantly spray sizing my quilt top in the process of making it, so having the backing also be stiff is just going to be helpful. So it's going to take you a little bit of time. So I'm going to continue this. I want you to, in my studio at home, my big ironing board like this is right in front of my TV. So I can be sitting and watching my favorite Star Trek episode while I am doing the pressing of my backing, or listen to a book on tape. Whatever it takes for you to be able to get the entire backing pressed out. Also, the pressing with the length of grain, like I talked about in the very first video, how to prepare your fabric. Pressing it so that the iron is moving in the way of the length of the fabric, not the width of the fabric. Pressing in the width can cause those little wrinkles. Oh, and then my ironing board. This is called a big board. It's very, very popular in quilting world to have what is called a big board. It's like 22 by 60 inches. Most of them can fit over your normal ironing board. I actually have mine on a little cabinet, but the idea is it can fit over your normal ironing board, and then you have this large flat surface. On this surface, to help speed up the pressing process, I do have my wool mat. Now this is a smaller version of the wool mat, and this is like the 18 by 24. This is so great to take to classes, everything that you need. It's not big enough to do this entire quilt. The one that I have on my big board is quite large, which also means it was quite expensive. But if I didn't have that, before I had that, I was just using my smaller mat, moving the fabric as I go to get it pressed. So something else to think about, and there are wool mats on the Fireside Quilts website also. So I'm going to continue pressing this, and we'll come back when I'm all done. So the backing is prepared, and I'm going to show you my basting process. And I'm going to show you just on my ironing board. Keep in mind that when you're doing a larger quilt, the ironing board is not going to be big enough. You're going to want to reference that other video I talked about to find out how to do that. Taping it down on the table, having some friends come and help you. But for this and smaller quilts, it actually works pretty well just right here on my big board. So I've got my backing. I've got it all pressed, and now I have folded it into quarters right sides out so that I can unfold it and it will be wrong side. So now I see the wrong side, and I want it to be centered. So I like these little creases that I've made in it so that I know where the center is. Now I'm going to take a couple of pins, and because I have this large wool mat, I'm just going to poke some pins right into it. If you don't have a large wool mat and you're working on just the hard surface of the large board, you could just tape it down using some of the blue painter's tape that won't leave any residue on your fabric. So I just put a few of those in. Now I'm going to use the secret weapon. The secret weapon is 505 basting spray. I love this stuff. This stuff is what really helps keep the layers together, along with the pinning that I'm going to do. Word of warning, you should be using this in a more well-ventilated area. I'm going to be using it in my basement here. We're going to turn on some fans, go upstairs, let it dissipate. I don't find it really floats that much. You could put a mask on. Everybody has a mask now, so if you wanted to, you could even try that. That was a thought I just had. I thought that would actually work. So I'm going to spray, and when I spray, I'm always going to keep my can pointed down at an angle and toward the center of the quilt. I'm not going to be spraying this way. That would just end up putting the adhesive off to the sides. Always trying to keep it into the center. So it's just going to be sprayed, and I'm only going to spray on the top that I can see at this point. I'm not going to worry about these sides yet. That's all. So not too much, not too little. I don't know how to tell you how much is too much. I know that if you do too much, your needle will start to stick with the thread. So don't do too much. And too little just means the pieces won't hold together. So now I've got my backing. Again, I've got my backing folded in a quarter, just like I did with my batting. And I'm going to lay that right down on that center crease. Now it's sticking there. Pull it over here. Right there is my center crease. Sticking, and you can see that it's kind of sticking to my backing fabric. Now I can flip this up and smooth that out. So that's going to stick. So for this process, doing the smaller quilts, I'm only going to work on the center first. After I get this all pinned, like I'll show you in a minute, then I'll slide it forward and do the next section. So just keep that in mind. I'm not doing it all at once. Now I'm going to do a little bit more spraying just on the top of this again before I put my backing down. Again, spraying toward the center of the quilt. The 505 does not have a lot of, it does have a little bit of an adhesive. You can see it a little bit, but not so much that you think you're at a rock and roll concert, okay? Now I'm going to take my quilt top. With the quilt top, again, I folded into the quarters, but I folded it wrong sides out, and I think it'll make sense why. Now I'm going to place it onto the center, and I'm going to keep myself that 3 inches that I gave for my backing and batting on the side. Unfold it to the other side. I got a little bit more on this side. Yep, I'm going to shift it over a little bit. So I'm pretty even on the 2 sides. There's my center line. Smooth that out. Flip this. And I want the straight lines of the quilt to stay straight. So I'm going to look here at the border. I'm visually seeing that this is straight. Pick this up, seeing that this is straight. Coming to the other side. Now I want you to notice these rumples in the middle, and I'm not going to panic. All right, my borders are straight. But what about all this extra in the middle? Just like that. I'm not going to push it all to the outside. If I push any of that excess to the outside, it's going to take those very straight square borders that I put on and enlarge them because the excess would be coming out. I don't want that. I want the sides of my quilt to be square. If I have a little excess fabric on the inside, that's okay. When the quilt gets washed, all the batting and the washing and the quilting is going to give it that texture anyway. It's okay. So now this is all nice and smooth, and it's time to do the pinning. I like to do pin basting. Some people like to do thread pasting. More power to you. For me, the threads get in the way. I don't find it to be as convenient. So I choose to do pin basting. So I'm going to do pin basting with a number 1 or number 2 size pin. Let me show you the 3 kinds I have in here. So that's a number 1. A number 1 size is about 1 inch long. A number 2 size is about 1.5 inches long. The third one I have in here is a bent pin. So this is a number 1 that is bent. The bend is supposed to make it easier to do the basting process. So for that supposed easierness, is that a word? I don't know. But the reason I mention it is they're going to charge you about 3 times more for that pin than they're going to be for that straight pin. And the way that I'm going to show you to close these pins, you are not going to find it any easier to use the bent one. So I would recommend you save that extra money for some more fabric instead. So, but these are all in my box. This is my little safety pin holding box a friend of mine had made me years and years and years ago. It's just a piece of styrofoam inside a pencil box. So the styrofoam is, I don't know, maybe about 1.5 inches thick. I cut it so it fit right in my pencil box so I can shut that when I'm taking it places, and they are stored, as you can see, open. So when I take them out to put them in, they're already open. When I'm quilting and I take them off the quilt, I just poke them right back in there. So everything is always open instead of having that pile of safety pins that are open and they're poking you, and then you could bleed on your quilt or some other disaster like that. So don't let that happen. Get something like this, kind of organize them. So you want to do the pinning in about a fist distance around. So when you take your pins, in the middle of this, I'm going to put a pin. So I poke it in and it's going into my wool mat. Then I can pick it up and then there it is. I don't have any of the wool mat, and I'm 85% sure I've gotten the backing also. Going to go to my next one, poke it in, come up. That got it out of my wool mat, and then whoops, there it is. Now the number 2 pins are a little bit thicker than the number 1 pins, which is why I kind of like the number 1s better. When those poke in and come up, they usually come out quite easily. So number 2s are nicer because they're a little bit bigger, but that also means that the metal pointy part is also a little bit bigger, makes it a little harder to go in. I'm going to put these all around the quilt. Let me just kind of give you an idea. Putting them in the middle of each one of these 6-inch squares, because the first thing you're going to quilt are going to be these straight lines. So you don't want your pins there. You want to be able to do this quilting and not have to take out any pins. Then when it comes time that you're actually quilting these squares, then you can take the pin out. So don't put them where your first lines of stitching are. Put them in the middle. When it comes to the border, I'll put one in the middle of each of the setting triangles, and then I'll do the opposite. So if there's setting triangle is here, in the border I'll put one here, so that they're all about a fist apart. After they're all down and they're still open, that's when I like to use a seam ripper. So this is one of my fancy seam rippers that you can get on our website that my friend Gina makes. There's an awl on one side and a seam ripper on the other. Pretty darn cool. They're all made with a really pretty epoxy, and they're all shiny, and you can't help but love them. So take a look at those. With the safety pin poked in and coming out, so there's about maybe 1/4 inch coming out here, take your seam ripper, the flat side of the neck. So the neck of the seam ripper has a thick side or a very, very flat side. Take the flat side and slide it under the pin. Now twist it so that the high side is on the fat side. So it's twisting up, and when it twists up, it makes the point of the pin rise up. So now you just take the pin, put it down, and it's shut. So slide it on the flat side, tip it, put the pin in. That way you've closed all of your ends. So I like to put in the fabric a couple of different ones. So I guess I don't have any more in. I like to put in a few of them, then go around and actually close them all. Now, word of warning, when you first start doing this closing action, it's going to seem a little awkward. Keep doing it. I promise you, it is so much easier than trying to close them with your fingers and keeping the quilt in place and not poking your finger with one, and again, bleeding all over your quilt. That would be a bad thing. I'm going to get a little bit more of this basted, and then we're going to move the quilt down so I can show you how to do the ending section. So I've got that center section all pinned and basted. All of the pins are closed now. And now I'm just going to slide that up so that I can see the rest of my quilt. And I do have this section that is already pin basted, so I know nothing is going to move along. Fold the batting and quilt top out of the way. Smooth out your backing. You could put some pins back in here to hold on to it. Then you're going to take your 505 again and do the spray baste on top of that. Bring your batting down, spray baste on top of that, and then bring the quilt top down. And again, when you're working on your quilt top, make the straight lines of the quilt, these border pieces, try your best to keep those straight, and any excess just kind of flatten out into the middle here. Do all the pins on that. When we get together next time, we will start the machine quilting. So if you have any questions, you know you can always email me at quiltingwithnancy.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss any more of the episodes. And the book is available on onpoint-tv.com, so you can purchase the book and make one of these yourself. See you next time.